What if the most effective tools for calming an anxious mind weren't developed in a pharmaceutical lab, prescribed by a psychiatrist, or invented by the wellness industry in the last 50 years, but were practiced in silence by Buddhist monks, prescribed by Greek philosophers, codified in ancient Indian medical texts, and observed across generations by civilizations that understood something about the human nervous system that modern science is only now finding the language to explain? Most people think anxiety is a modern problem. The pace of life, the screens, the news cycle. What they don't know is that ancient civilizations in India, in China, in ancient Greece, in Japan were already treating it deliberately, systematically, with practices so precisely targeted at the nervous system that modern neuroscience has since confirmed the mechanisms one pathway at a time. And in several cases, the evidence is now so strong that psychiatrists and clinical psychologists are formally incorporating these ancient practices into treatment protocols. Today I'm going to show you 10 ancient secrets for healing the anxious mind that modern science has since validated or is actively proving right. These aren't wellness trends. They aren't influencer content. They are practices with documented histories spanning thousands of years, observed across civilizations that had no contact with each other, and every single one of them was used not because it sounded good, but because people observed, generation after generation, that it worked. Don't forget to like and hype this video if you loved it, and of course, subscribe. Let's get into it. Secret 1. Mindfulness meditation, the Buddhist practice that became clinical medicine. 2,500 years ago, in the forests of northern India, a physician-philosopher named Siddhartha Gautama began documenting something he had observed through sustained practice and careful attention, that the human mind, left unobserved, defaults to a state of anxious rumination, cycling through past regrets and future fears in a loop that produces suffering without producing solutions, and that the deliberate, disciplined practice of bringing attention back to the present moment, again and again, without judgment, interrupted that loop at its source. He called it vipassana. It spread across Asia, was refined over 2.5 millennia, and eventually reached the West in the 20th century, where researchers began testing it in clinical settings. What they found was extraordinary. A meta-analysis published in JAMA Internal Medicine analyzed 47 randomized controlled trials involving more than 3,500 participants. It found moderate evidence that mindfulness meditation programs produced meaningful reductions in anxiety, depression, and pain. A 2024 meta-analysis published in Scientific Reports, covering 26 separate RCTs, confirmed that mindfulness meditation significantly reduces depressive symptoms. The UK's National Health Service now formally recommends mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is built directly on Buddhist Vipassana practice as a first-line treatment for recurrent depression and anxiety. Mindfulness practice measurably reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, and strengthens connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, improving the brain's capacity to regulate emotional response rather than be controlled by it. 2.5 millennia of Buddhist practice. 47 randomized controlled trials. The NHS now prescribes what the monks discovered. That is not a coincidence. That is the longest clinical study in human history finally getting its peer review. Secret 2. Yoga, the 5,000-year nervous system reset. 5,000 years ago, yoga was not exercise. It was medicine. The Vedic practitioners who systematized it understood, through careful observation across generations, that specific combinations of posture, breath, and sustained attention produced measurable changes in the body's state. They called it the regulation of prana, the vital life force. What they were observing, without the vocabulary to name it, was the shift from physiological stress to physiological recovery. Modern clinical research has confirmed that observation in precise biological terms. A 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis published in Depression and Anxiety, the Wiley Journal, analyzed 24 randomized controlled trials on yoga for clinically diagnosed depressive disorders. The results found that yoga significantly reduces depression severity compared to both passive and active control groups. Yoga was included in the 2024 Lancet E-Clinical Medicine Network meta-analysis of 676 randomized controlled trials as an efficacious intervention for less severe depression, placing it alongside established psychological therapies in the evidence ranking. Specific yogic postures measurably reduce cortisol within a single session. The slow, rhythmic breathing that anchors every yoga practice shifts the body's autonomic balance in a direction that clinical research now associates directly with anxiety reduction. The ancient practitioners who designed this system 5,000 years ago were engineering outcomes they had no biochemical vocabulary for. 5,000 years of documented practice. 24 randomized controlled trials. They were right about what the body needed. They were just missing the biochemistry to explain why. Secret 3. Stoic philosophy, the ancient thinking system that became CBT. Around 50 AD, a man named Epictetus was a slave in Rome. He had no freedom, no property, and no political power. He had complete control over exactly one thing: how he chose to interpret events. He taught that anxiety arises not from what happens to us, but from our judgments about what happens to us, and that the disciplined practice of examining and challenging those judgments was the primary tool of mental freedom. His students wrote everything down. 2,000 years later, a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck read those writings and built the most evidence-based psychological treatment for anxiety and depression ever developed. Beck called it cognitive behavioral therapy. He explicitly credited Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and the broader Stoic tradition as direct intellectual ancestors. CBT works by identifying and challenging the automatic negative thoughts, the irrational interpretations of events that drive anxiety and depression. That is Stoic philosophy translated into clinical protocol. The evidence base for CBT is larger than that of any other psychological intervention ever studied. It has been validated in hundreds of randomized controlled trials across dozens of countries and populations. The American Psychological Association, the NHS, and virtually every major mental health body on earth recognizes it as the gold standard psychological treatment for anxiety and depressive disorders. A 2024 Lancet Network meta-analysis of 676 RCTs confirmed CBT is among the most efficacious treatments for both conditions. Epictetus didn't know what a randomized controlled trial was. He knew that examining your thinking changed your experience of reality. Aaron Beck confirmed it with the largest evidence base in the history of psychology. The ancient slave and the modern psychiatrist reached the same conclusion by different routes. Secret 4. Acupuncture, the 2,000-year needle system. In ancient China, physicians of the Han dynasty were mapping what they called meridians, channels of vital energy running through the body. They documented, over centuries of careful clinical observation, that inserting fine needles at specific points along these channels produced measurable effects on conditions ranging from pain to emotional dysregulation. Traditional Chinese medicine classified anxiety as a disruption of the heart-spirit relationship. Acupuncture was the correction. Modern neuroscience doesn't use the language of meridians or heart-spirit. It uses the language of neurotransmitter modulation, HPA axis regulation, and cortisol suppression. The outcome data, however, aligns in directions that make it difficult to dismiss. A Cochrane systematic review, the gold standard of clinical evidence, analyzed 64 randomized controlled trials involving 7,104 participants and found that acupuncture produced moderate evidence of reduced depression severity compared to no treatment. A 2024 network meta-analysis published in Frontiers in Neuroscience, analyzing 198 RCTs involving 8,923 participants, found that acupuncture combined with antidepressants outperformed antidepressants alone with certain traditional Chinese herbal formulas rivaling antidepressants in effect size with fewer adverse events. Honest framing matters here. Grade evidence for acupuncture remains low to moderate due to heterogeneity across trials, and it is best approached as adjunct support rather than standalone treatment. But the biological logic is increasingly understood. Acupuncture appears to modulate serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine pathways, regulate cortisol through the HPA axis, and reduce inflammatory cytokine levels. The ancient Chinese physicians were targeting the same biological systems with the same tool, 2,000 years before anyone knew those systems existed. The meridian maps were imprecise. The outcomes they produced were not. Secret 5. Ashwagandha, the root that measurably lowers cortisol. Ayurvedic physicians described ashwagandha as giving a person the strength of a stallion, specifically in the context of depletion, exhaustion, and the failure of vital energy they associated with chronic stress. They prescribed the root of Withania somnifera for exhaustion, cognitive decline, and what they called the consumption of ojas, the body's essential vitality. They had been doing so for 3,000 years before anyone in the West had any awareness the plant existed. What they were observing was cortisol dysregulation. They didn't have that term. They had the clinical outcomes. A 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis published in BJ Psych Open analyzed 15 randomized controlled trials involving 873 participants. The findings confirmed that ashwagandha supplementation significantly reduced anxiety scores on the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale, significantly reduced serum cortisol levels, and improved self-reported stress measures compared to placebo. A separate 2023 double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial published in Medicine demonstrated that standardized ashwagandha root extract significantly alleviated stress and anxiety and improved quality of life in healthy adults by modulating stress hormones. The active compounds are withanolides, steroidal lactones that modulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's central stress response system. When cortisol is chronically elevated, it drives inflammation, immune suppression, cognitive impairment, and the neurological cascade that produces anxiety. Withanolides interrupt that cascade at the regulatory level. What the Ayurvedic physicians called the consumption of ojas, modern endocrinology calls cortisol dysregulation. Different vocabulary, the same biological reality. And the same root, 3,000 years later, is still the prescription. Secret 6. Pranayama breathwork, the ancient technology of the nervous system. Every ancient medical tradition that studied the human mind eventually arrived at the breath. The Vedic physicians of ancient India called it pranayama, the conscious extension and control of breathing. They documented it with the same precision they applied to herbal medicine and surgical technique. Specific breath patterns produced specific states. Slow, extended exhales produced calm. The relationship between breath and mental state was not metaphorical for these practitioners. It was mechanical. Breath was the lever. The mind was what moved. Modern neurosciences confirmed the mechanism with extraordinary precision. The vagus nerve, the primary communication highway between the body and the brain, is directly activated by slow, diaphragmatic breathing. When you exhale slowly, the vagus nerve signals a cascade of physiological changes. Heart rate drops, cortisol production decreases, and the body shifts measurably out of stress mode into recovery mode. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented biological sequence that happens within minutes of beginning slow, controlled breathing. A 2022 randomized controlled trial published in PMC confirmed that combined breathing techniques significantly reduced perceived stress compared to control conditions. A comprehensive review of breathwork and autonomic nervous system regulation confirmed that slow-paced breathing at approximately 6 breaths per minute produces the most significant reductions in anxiety markers. The ancient Vedic name for this deliberate control of breath is pranayama. The modern clinical term is vagal breathing protocol. They are the same intervention, 2,500 years apart. The breath was always the lever. It took 2,500 years to build the instruments that could measure what happened when you pulled it. Let's keep going, because the next secret on this list is one that Japan turned into formal preventive medicine, and the clinical evidence now confirms what ancient cultures across every continent already practiced instinctively. Secret 7. Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, the practice Japan made official medicine. Before Japan gave it a name, every culture on earth practiced it. Ancient Greeks walked among trees to think. Confucian scholars sought forest for contemplation. Indigenous traditions across every continent used nature immersion as a restorative practice. The evidence that time in nature reduced suffering was so consistent across so many unrelated civilizations that it was woven into philosophy, medicine, and spiritual practice simultaneously, without any of those traditions being aware the others had arrived at the same conclusion. In 1982, Japan's forestry agency formalized this ancient intuition as Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, and designated it a component of the National Preventive Health Program. Researchers then began measuring what ancient practitioners had only observed. What they found was not subtle. A PRISMA-compliant, systematic review and meta-analysis covering 20 studies confirmed that Shinrin-yoku measurably improves depression, anxiety, and anger in the short term. Field experiments conducted across 24 forests throughout Japan measured salivary cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate variability, and sympathetic nervous system activity before and after forest immersion. The results were consistent. Parasympathetic activity increased, sympathetic activity decreased, cortisol dropped, and self-reported mood improved. The mechanism includes phytocides, aromatic compounds released by trees, which have been shown to increase natural killer cell activity and reduce the stress hormone adrenaline measurably within hours of exposure. Every ancient civilization that ever walked among trees for peace was producing a measurable biological effect. Japan simply became the first modern nation to put that observation into a government health program. The rest of the world's medical systems are still catching up. Secret 8. Walking, the oldest antidepressant in history. Hippocrates prescribed it. Confucius prescribed it. Ancient Ayurvedic texts prescribed it. Aristotle taught his philosophy while walking. His entire school of thought became known as the Peripatetics, from the Greek word for those who walk. No ancient civilization that left a medical record omitted deliberate walking as a therapeutic prescription. It was so universally documented across medical traditions with no shared language and no common origin that the convergence is striking. Every physician who observed human beings carefully enough came to the same conclusion. Walking was medicine. The mechanism is now understood precisely. Sustained rhythmic movement activates the brain's dopaminergic and serotonergic systems, increasing the production and release of both neurotransmitters that antidepressant medications target pharmacologically. A Lancet meta-analysis found that 150 minutes of walking per week produces measurable antidepressant effects comparable to medication in mild to moderate cases of depression and anxiety. A 2024 bibliometric analysis in Frontiers in Neuroscience confirmed that physical activity is among the most heavily researched and most consistently validated interventions for both anxiety and depression in the entire clinical literature. The critical framing: walking doesn't just reduce symptoms. It changes brain structure. Regular aerobic activity measurably increases hippocampal volume, the brain region most associated with memory and emotional regulation, and the region most significantly reduced by chronic stress. Ancient physicians couldn't see the hippocampus. They could see what happened to people who walked regularly versus people who didn't. The oldest antidepressant in human history requires no prescription and costs nothing. Every ancient medical tradition figured that out. Modern neuroscience has spent decades confirming why. Secret 9 Fermented Foods, the 13,000-year gut-brain medicine. The ancient Koreans who developed kimchi had no concept of the gut-brain axis. The Japanese who developed miso had never heard of lactobacillus. The peoples of the Caucasus who produced kefir had no awareness that 90% of the body's serotonin is manufactured in the gut. What they had was the most rigorous empirical tool available to them: observation across generations. And what they observed was that people who ate fermented foods consistently were calmer, more resilient, and less prone to the kind of mental fragility that the ancient world had no clinical vocabulary for but recognized clearly. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication network between the digestive system and the central nervous system, is now one of the most active research areas in psychiatry. The gut microbiome produces neurotransmitters, modulates the immune system's inflammatory state, and communicates with the brain through pathways that influence mood, cognition, and emotional regulation. 90% of the body's serotonin is manufactured there, a fact no ancient civilization knew, but several behaved as though they understood. A 2024 study from the University of Virginia isolated lactobacillus, the primary bacterium in kimchi, miso, and found it directly influences the body's management of psychological stress, reducing markers of anxiety and depression measurably in animal models. A Science Direct 2024 review confirmed that fermented foods modulate neurotrophic chemicals, including brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a compound directly linked to neuroplasticity, depression, and cognitive resilience. The landmark Stanford Cell study found that individuals consuming fermented foods daily for 10 weeks showed reductions in 19 separate inflammatory proteins, including interleukin-6, linked to anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. The ancient cultures that built fermentation traditions 13,000 years ago were practicing gut-brain medicine without the neuroscience. The neuroscience is now building the explanation for what they practiced. Secret 10 Cold water exposure, the ancient stress inoculation. No ancient civilization that left a medical record omitted cold water. Hippocrates prescribed cold baths. The Spartans made cold water immersion mandatory from childhood. The Japanese misogi purification ritual, immersion in cold rivers and waterfalls, has been documented for over 1,000 years as a practice for mental clarity and spiritual renewal. Nordic cultures built entire therapeutic traditions around it. Ancient civilizations with no shared medical tradition, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all arrived at the same conclusion. Deliberate exposure to cold produced something that looked like mental fortitude. Modern neuroscience is now providing the mechanism, and it is striking. Cold water immersion triggers an immediate norepinephrine surge of up to 300%. Norepinephrine is the same neurotransmitter targeted by an entire class of antidepressant medications, the SNRIs. It also triggers dopamine release and produces an adaptive response in the HPA axis. With repeated cold exposure, the cortisol spike to stressors measurably diminishes. The body, trained by controlled cold stress, becomes more resilient to uncontrolled psychological stress. A PMC 2205 systematic review protocol for cold water exposure and mental health has been formally published, confirming the research is active, legitimate, and advancing rapidly. Important framing. The evidence here is promising and mechanistically well-grounded, but cold water exposure is not yet an FDA-approved treatment, and the human clinical trials are still developing, particularly for individuals with cardiovascular conditions. The ancient Spartans who immersed their children in cold rivers every morning were not practicing cruelty. They were engineering stress resilience through a mechanism that neuroscience is still formalizing. They were simply a few thousand years ahead of the clinical literature. 10 Secret. Thousands of years of accumulated practice across civilizations that had no psychiatry, no neuroscience, no clinical trials, and who still identified approaches to the anxious mind so precisely targeted to the human nervous system that modern research keeps confirming them, one mechanism at a time. None of them were invented. They were observed. Ancient physicians and ordinary people paid extraordinary attention to what happened when the mind was trained in a specific way, and what happened when it wasn't. They built that knowledge into philosophy, into medicine, into daily ritual and cultural tradition, so it would survive long enough to be tested. Modern neuroscience didn't discover any of this, it confirmed it. If you're experiencing severe anxiety or depression, please seek professional support. These practices work best alongside, not instead of, clinical care. Drop a comment and tell me which secret surprised you most. We read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more ancient life secrets. We are just getting started.